I never thought I'd be one of those men, the ones who sit in the dark, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching their reflection more than the world outside the window. I used to think betrayal was something that happened to other people. You know, weak men, inattentive husbands, the kind who ignored the signs. But now looking back, I realize how blind love can make you. How quiet the sound of a heart breaking can really be. Her name was Anna. We'd been married for 9 years. I met her at a photography exhibition in downtown Seattle. She was radiant, sharp-witted, with this quiet confidence that drew me in like gravity. I worked in cybersecurity. She was a freelance journalist. Together, we built what looked like a good life, a modern apartment, weekend trips, the shared bank account, and the kind of laughter that makes people jealous. But you don't notice when that laughter fades. You just wake up one day and realize it's been gone for a long time. It started small. She began working late, writing feature pieces that apparently took her to hotel lobbies and off-the-record meetings. Her phone started living face down, notifications silenced. The smell of her perfume changed. When I asked, she said she just wanted a new scent. That's how subtle betrayal begins, not with a bang, but a whisper. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. I buried myself in work, long hours, longer nights. But something inside me, maybe instinct, maybe paranoia, kept whispering that something was wrong. So, I did what a cybersecurity analyst does best. I started digging. I installed a discreet tracking program on her phone, disguised as a routine system update. It wasn't hard. She trusted me completely, or maybe she just stopped caring. For 2 weeks, I watched her messages. Most were innocent. Then, on a Thursday night, I saw it. "Can't wait to see you again, baby. Same hotel." The message hit me like a punch to the gut. It came from a number saved only as my hands were shaking. But I opened the rest of the thread. The conversation went back months. There were pictures, some explicit, some intimate in ways that left no room for doubt. I didn't move for hours, just stared at the screen until the lines blurred. My mind felt like it was splitting open, torn between fury and disbelief. How could she? How could we end like this? That night, I drove to the hotel mentioned in the messages, a small place near Pike Place, one of those cozy boutique ones with dim lighting and overpriced wine. I parked across the street and waited. At 8:40 p.m., she walked out. Her hair was loose, and she wore the same black dress she'd worn on our anniversary. But she wasn't alone. A tall man in a tailored suit walked beside her, his hand on her back. They laughed, touched, kissed. It was like watching someone else's life, like I was the ghost haunting my own marriage. I followed them for a few blocks, keeping my distance. They went to a wine bar. She looked happy, radiant, even happier than she'd been with me in years. That was the moment I felt something inside me snap. I didn't confront them. Not that night. I went home, sat in the dark, and replayed every conversation we'd had for months. Every excuse, every lie. And slowly, something cold and deliberate began to grow inside me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, deception, a calculated destruction of trust, and I wasn't going to let it end there. I began collecting information, not just on her but on him. Whoever he was, he had money, connections. I traced his number through data leaks, found his name, Ethan Cole, corporate attorney, married, 2 kids. His wife's name was Melissa. By the time dawn broke, I knew everything about him, his firm, his address, his car, the kind of secrets that could shatter a life. And that's when the idea started forming. I didn't want to kill him. No, that would be too easy. To Queen. I wanted him to feel it, the same kind of slow, creeping agony I'd felt watching my world crumble. Anna came home around 2 a.m. Her makeup was smudged. I pretended to be asleep. When she slipped into bed beside me, her scent, his scent, clung to her. That was the moment I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to destroy them both. Not out of rage, not even out of heartbreak, but out of a quiet, deliberate need for justice. And justice, I decided, was best served cold and carefully planned. They say the first step in any good plan is to make a promise to yourself. I made mine in the dark, not a fevered vow shouted into the night, but a calculation: angles, margins, exit routes, things I could control, things I could predict. The emotion had done its work. Now intellect would finish the job. For a week I watched them, not like a man in love, not like a man ruined, like an analyst parsing a stream of data. And as patterns became a graph, where she went, who she texted, the rhythm of her laughter when Ethan was near, I mapped it all to a calendar file that I kept in a folder named routines. Routines are predictable. Predictability is leverage. She still left small breadcrumbs of care coffee grounds in the sink, the thermos I liked packed in the fridge. The playlist she made for me years ago still on the living room speaker. Maybe part of her thought she could do both, the life with me and the other life in the margins. That arrogance made my work easier. First I needed his world. Ethan Cole, corporate attorney, clean suits, clean lies. If he had enemies, I'd find them. If he had sins, I'd catalog them. The public side of him was immaculate. Articles he'd written about fiduciary duty, LinkedIn endorsements, a wife who posted the right kinds of weekend photos. But the private side, where men believed themselves shielded, was always a little messier if you knew how to look. I set traps in his digital life, subtle, surgical. An email spoof here, a planted rumor there. I didn't want to burn him yet. I wanted him to feel edges before the blade. So I sent a ghost invoice to his firm under a vendor name he'd never seen. Small, plausible amounts. The kind of thing accounting notices, but lets slide unless someone insists on audit. I made sure the return path pointed back to a dead server in a jurisdiction that required subpoenas to trace. That would sit in his inbox like a fly, buzzing, annoying, but ignorable unless he chose not to ignore it. At the same time, I worked on the domestic perimeter. Anna was beginning to alter her routine for convenience: less time on the phone in public, more dinners at his place or new cafes. Her contacts list shuttered, names with initials, burner numbers, encrypted messaging app accounts. I bought a small Faraday pouch online and slipped it into my jacket pocket. When she left the house, I took the opportunity to lift her phone briefly, cleanly, using a sleight of hand she never saw coming. I didn't clone it. I mirrored it, a shadow copy that left no trace. I wanted to keep her habits untouched, so the data stayed honest. The first real break came in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Anna had a midday assignment she used as cover: an interview with a local nonprofit. I watched her park, watched her cross the sidewalk. I knew the nonprofit's address by heart from my map, but she didn't go in. The phone ping I'd been waiting for lit my screen. 12:31 p.m., room 304, the Meridian. The Meridian is a glass tower with a valet. Room 304 is a corner suite at the boutique hotel 2 blocks down from Pike Place. Kind of place you get only when you want discretion. I booked the room across the hall under the name of a dead acquaintance and checked in with a neutral smile. The job of revenge, the kind I was planning, requires patience braided with a higher cruelty. To make them feel every inch of the suffering without breaking yourself on the edge first. I sat in a chair, watching the corridor like an editor waiting for the camera to roll. At 12:28 she returned with him. Ethan Cole carried himself like someone who had never been denied. The way he moved made me think of courtrooms and polished wood, authoritative, efficient. He kissed her like a man marking territory, like a man who knew what it took to keep a secret. They moved into the suite. I rang the bell of my room, and when the door opened I set a small device by the handle, a recorder with a directional mic, a cheap intrusion but enough to catch the tenor of their voices. One shouldn't glorify such things. They are small instruments of cruelty fitted into larger designs. But we were past pity. What I heard muted through the thin hall wall wasn't passion. That myth dies quickly. It was logistical. Names, promises, dates. Hold until Q4, Ethan said. Transfer through offshore, staggered. He sounded bored and professional. The distant cadence of someone discussing property arrangements, not people. Anna's voice was quieter. There was a tremor, but the words were neat and rational. We'll be careful. I've got him distracted. Distracted. The word tasted like contempt. She had no idea I'd been watching the metadata of the emails she sent to me, the way she'd used the word project to describe late nights. She thought my attention was dulled by work or contentment. That miscalculation saved my life and hardened my resolve. I recorded everything, of course. I cataloged the times, the phrases, the proffered names. Back in my rented room, I played the audio into software that could extract frequency, tone, hesitations. It felt obscene, like peering at a living thing under glass. I labeled the files with cold precision. 304_12_28_ tone analysis.wav. 304_12_28_ transcript.txt. Documentation makes you sane in a way. It makes revenge less a fit and more a policy. Over the next month I escalated slowly. The hardest part was the languid, constant lie that acts like a tide. Every time I thought I had proof enough to confront her, new data appeared that complicated the picture. There was another player, a person I hadn't expected, Melissa Colethan's wife. Her social feeds were a masterclass in curated grief and Instagram virtue. I found credit card receipts, spa days, dinners, a bracelet bearing a name that wasn't hers. She didn't know, or she did and had chosen to look away. Either way, the optics made a deliciously useful chess piece. I began to feed the pieces to one another carefully. I hint to Melissa an anonymous postcard with a cropped photo of Ethan and Anna leaving a restaurant. A late-night call to Ethan's assistant with a false rumor about an embezzler at his firm. Tension, like pressure, will fracture even the strongest stone, but the sharpest tool is not rumor. It's leverage. By then I had evidence of payments, a chain of tiny cryptocurrency movements routed through mixers, eventually clearing into a shell account registered to a consultant named Harbor Analytics. Harbor Analytics didn't exist in any business registry. It existed in the shadow economy of laundering and data sales. I traced funds back to a company tied to clients Ethan represented. The implication was a simple arithmetic of guilt. If they were diverting funds, they would need plausible reasons. If they need plausible reasons, they would need people to sign those reasons. Contracts, documents with my old handwriting, my security stamps used without my consent, my name used as a ghost. The plan coalesced into a series of moves in my head. Expose financial duplicity. Sow personal doubt between husband and wife. Fracture Ethan's professional trust. Isolate Anna socially and financially to make her desperation visible. Make them bleed where it hurts reputation, livelihood, the comfortable illusion of control. Still, I needed one more thing: proximity. If you want to take a man apart and tell him why he's a fool afterward, sometimes you have to enter his house. Not to destroy it, though I considered that too, but to take a measure of his life in the way someone takes the measure of a room before tearing down the partitions. I rented a studio a block away from Ethan's office under the pretense of a freelance consultation. From that vantage, I could watch his comings and goings. I could identify patterns in his driver, the time he left the office, the restaurants he favored. It's amazing how predictable powerful men can be. The moral calculus that keeps most people decent is a ladder one rung at a time. You climb, and you forget how easy it was to step back down. The ladder for me had been stripped away. I had no illusions of becoming better. My calculations were clean, each action a variable. Each risk had a mitigant. My life, they had taken it, so I'd design a sequence to take things back. The night I set the first part of it in motion, I felt the old part of me, boyish, naive, drift away. I parked my car 3 blocks from Anna and Ethan's usual place, the way I used to park when we first started dating. I watched her arrive, watched her leave with him the way the ocean watches the moon. Then, like a surgeon, I performed the simplest incision. I left a letter on her windshield face down and folded into a shape only someone intimate would recognize. Inside, I wrote 3 words: "We need to talk." It was a small thing, but small things start avalanches. The next day, I watched as everything I'd started to disturb caught the tiniest wind: a whispered phone call that made Melissa cancel a dinner, a shuffled account audit that made Ethan postpone a meeting. People moved differently. The world itself seemed to tilt a fraction toward truth. And in that tilt, I tasted the first austere sweetness of justice. Cold, clean, inevitable. You don't get to choose how revenge shapes you. You only choose how precise you will be. I chose precise. I had no illusions about redemption. I had a file labeled Endgame and a calendar with red circles. They looked good to me. They felt necessary. The rest would be method and time. The rest would be proof, exposure, ruin. The rest would be making them understand the cost of what they had done. That night I sat in the darkness with the center of the city breathing softly in the distance. I looked at the 2 files on my laptop: 304_12_28_transcript.txt and the crypto chain trace, and then at my hands. They didn't tremble. They had learned their job. Tomorrow I would plant the next seed. They always tell you revenge will hollow you out. That's the cliché. The truth is messier. Revenge reconfigures you. It adds new gears where old tenderness used to be. You think you'll come back to yourself after the storm, but storms don't leave landscapes unchanged. They carve things you can't repair. After the letter on the windshield, my small incision, the world rearranged itself in ways I'd anticipated and ways I hadn't. Melissa canceled the dinner. Ethan postponed his meeting, fingers twitching at his phone like a gambler who smells a bad deck. Anna started texting more cautiously, shorter bursts, the kind of messages people use when they feel the walls closing. I sat back and watched the dominoes line up. When you design a fall, you have to understand the impulse of each tile. Push one too hard, and the pattern distorts. Push too gentle, and the chain stalls. I'd learned to calibrate both the digital and the human. An anonymous tip to a journalist. A leaked invoice that would rattle the firm's CFO into double-checking payments. A whisper to a paralegal about misapplied client funds that would seed at the top. Phase 2 began with proximity and patience. I needed to be where they thought I never would. And I had grown careless in one regard. She'd begun to use the same cafe to kill time before meetings. Not the fancy downtown place. She preferred a quieter, dimmer room near the docks. It was a place with paper walls and bad coffee, but the kind of anonymity only those who worked nearby appreciated. She didn't notice if someone sat in the corner twice a week. People are cruelly blind to routine, so I sat, coffee cooling, laptop open, but not connected to the network. I watched. I cataloged her pauses, the way she flipped a page in a notebook, the particular slant of her pen when she was nervous. Small things, but they meant something. They told me what bait would look like and how hard I'd need to strike. When Ethan started to notice the flurries, I'd initiated calls from investors, and our audit ping he hadn't authorized, he delegated. He had a team at the firm that could pushing papers and placate journalists. That's their defense. Procedure. People in suits hide behind protocols like armor, assuaging fear by generating forms and reports. But when you corrode the paper trail and make the forms contradict themselves, procedure turns into paralysis. I used that paralysis against him. A forged ledger entry here, a subpoena-worthy email trace there. I didn't try to blow up his firm in a day. Instead, I put a pebble in its gearboxes and waited for the grinding. But there was a second current running under my plan, and it was the most fragile and the most dangerous. I had to fracture Anna's illusions without destroying the parts of her that loved me. You cannot invade someone's life and expect the result to be a simple portrait of villain or victim. People are complicated. I'd loved her, hurt by her, And in that complexity lived my leverage and my potential ruin. 2 weeks after the hotel spy, I made a move that felt like crossing a line. I drove to the small seaside town where Anna's mother lived. It's a quiet place, worn benches, smell of brine, gulls that sound like old men making jokes. I knew Anna called her every Sunday. That's how I learned she'd used the family trust as a route to funnel consulting allowances into accounts I couldn't trace. Why would a freelance reporter need a consulting allowance? The answer was a path I'd known before: payola favors, hushes, and shadow contracts. I presented the mother with a photograph. No note, no accusation. Just a single print of Anna with Ethan outside the boutique hotel at midnight, hand in hand. The old woman's face folded like tissue. She didn't scream, didn't faint. She folded the photo with more care than I'd used to fold love letters. The pain in her eyes wasn't for herself. It was for the daughter she thought she knew. That sight made me dizzy. It made me understand something simple and terrible. Even the juggernaut of my rational plan could not isolate the human cost. When you move pieces on a board, you also move people who live inside those pieces. There is collateral that cannot be calculated. You can account for cash flows and documents. You can't account for the tiny deaths inside someone else's heart. I wondered briefly if I should stop. Then I thought about Marcus, how he'd smirked in Suite 407 like he owned the map of everyone he'd ever used. I thought about the recordings, the termination protocol, Rain's clipped voice like an executioner's order. I thought about the quiet power of men who believe they can order other people's fates under the law's shadow. I thought about the ways the system protected its own. So I didn't stop. Phase 3 required extraction and contamination. I needed a smoking gun that would make Ethan's world retract and expose the firm to external scrutiny, and I needed to make him look like the one who'd been deceived by his partner. I'd already planted the forged ledger entries and the private messages that hinted at embezzlement. Now I needed to ensure that the auditors would find them legitimately, that the firm's forensic team would have to produce a public report, proof, not rumor. To do that, I had to get into the firm's internal drive. Their network was supposed to be airtight. It had to be. Their clients were banks and media companies that paid well for silence. But nothing is airtight. Even steel corrodes. I sat in my rented studio at 2 a.m., my fingers moving like a pianist's over scripts that had taken months to compose. Backdoors, seed nodes, safe write packets. I had written a lifetime of access into systems and how to circumvent them. I used siphon exploits, small, invisible things that register as glitches until you let them out into the open. It took 3 tries. The first attempt tripped a monitoring alert. I fed that alert to a honeypot I'd created 3 months earlier, a fake vulnerability that absorbed any probe while I redirected the firm's eyes elsewhere. The second attempt was blocked by a new patch I hadn't accounted for. The firm had finally invested in what they call behavioral analytics after a scare last quarter. The third attempt worked because I had learned from the first 2. It was patient, polite, and created an appearance of a legitimate maintenance job executed by an external vendor. People let maintenance pass. Once inside, I seeded the ledger. I didn't plant obvious theft. I planted contract cross-references, documents that, when stitched together, told a story of ghost invoices, staged research fees, and off-ledger consulting agreements that routed money through Harbor Analytics into shell accounts. I placed legal headers, timestamp signatures, and my own handwriting, all forged convincingly. The point wasn't to steal money, someone else could do that. It was to make the paperwork look like a conspiracy so complete an auditor couldn't ignore it. Then I did the hardest thing. I sent an anonymous tip to a journalist I once dated, the one who still had the hunger for a big scoop. Her name was Mara. She'd left the city months ago, but she resurfaced for the right story. I wrote her a crisp, dangerous note. You'll want to sit down for this. Harbor Analytics, Rains, Ward Link. She called in less than an hour. Within 48 hours, the newsroom had a rumor. Within a week, an audit firm issued a preliminary notice to Ethan's firm about irregularities. The board convened in panic. Ethan stayed late at the office for 5 nights straight. He refused to tell anyone why. The stress found him in the corners, his smiles brittle, his speech clipped. He didn't sleep. He did what powerful men do when their foundations tremble. He tried to secure every surface, rain fences around the liable zones, and then contracted outside counsel to manage reputational damage. He was reactive. That was my advantage. Piece by piece, I watched the fortress crumble from within. But the most satisfying shift came in human terms. Melissa found another photograph in her mailbox. A Polaroid of Ethan holding hands with Anna outside a different hotel months before, half smiled, half guilty. She confronted him in the kitchen at dawn, voice steady but flat. It was a scene I had imagined 100 times in rehearsals. Watching it unfold made my teeth ache. You'll ask whether I felt triumphant when the marriage began to fracture. I'll be honest, for a heartbeat there was a glint of something like victory. But it was a small thing. Revenge rarely tastes like victory in the mouth. It tastes like ash. That evening, Anna called me. Just me. Her voice was raw but not panic-controlled. "We need to talk," she said. I thought of the letter on the windshield, the photograph at her mother's house, the ledger, the Polaroid at Melissa's home. How many of these threads were my doing? How many were already in motion when I stepped into the machinery? We met in the park where we walked as newlyweds, the fountain still turning, the benches newly painted. She sat across from me, hands clasped. Her eyes had that look of someone who had rehearsed vulnerability, but was at the end of rehearsal. "Ethan," she began, "I didn't want this." She said that, and I could tell she believed it, but the person on the bench wasn't the same woman who had once laughed at my bad jokes over burnt coffee. "You didn't want what?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. "To hurt me, to involve yourself with that man, to be part of their scheme." She flinched genuinely. "It wasn't a scheme. Not like you think." "Save it," I said quietly. "I'm not naive anymore." Then she delivered something I hadn't expected, a sliver of apology, not for the affair but for the deceit. She admitted the recruitment, the coercion, the fact that the directorate wouldn't allow refusal forever. She explained Marcus as a handler, not a lover. She said Rains had leverage, that they had files linking me to security lapses fabricated months before, that threatening my career and safety had been the leverage. Her voice broke the one time she said it had been blackmail. "They threatened to ruin you if I didn't cooperate," she said. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep you safe." The admission landed like a stone. I'd suspected coercion, my intuition had smelled it, but hearing her call it by name, blackmail, threats of legal ruin, the unmistakable government bureaucratic tone of Jonathan Rains, the outline came into sharper relief. This was not merely a romance that had gone off script. This was a weaponized betrayal designed to isolate me and co-opt the loyalty of someone I'd loved. For a moment, I almost let the ache inside me translate into pity. Almost, but pity does not balance contract ledgers or halt a past signed in other people's blood. I listened, catalogued every word, every pause. Each contrition held a detail I could verify or bury deeper. She spoke of meetings, of passwords, of a time when she'd tried to walk away and been forced back. She told me about a trigger phrase, Phase 3, that signaled escalation if the target was closer to truth than they should be. She put the phrase in my hand like a lit match. When she left, she kissed me on the cheek the way people do when they want company, not intimacy. It felt like a farewell. I watched her walk away and felt the city tilt under my feet. There are crossroads in life where the fabric of who you are splits, and something new stitches itself in its place. This meeting was such a scene. I had gained information that complicated the narrative, but my rage had not lessened. If anything, it had refined into a more surgical aim: stop Rains and the directorate from using people as currency. Not because I wanted to be magnanimous, but because the machinery that ordered my destruction would not stop at me. If it could blackmail one person, it could blackmail dozens. If it could co-opt Anna, it could co-opt an entire web of influence. So I accelerated. The plan that had begun as a scalpel now became a sequence of controlled demolitions directed at Raines's legal and financial holdings. But before I burned him, I wanted him to smell the coming smoke. I wanted him to know the hands of consequence already reached for his collar. I fed selected files to journalists and lawmakers, created plausible chains between Harbor Analytics and shell contracts used to launder influence payments, and set in motion audits by authorities who were still clean-eyed and hungry for scandal. Days stretched into tense weeks. Ethan's firm teetered. Melissa hired counsel, then private investigators. Anna stopped answering my calls and came and went like someone with instructions. The city watched us in the small way it watches other people's tragedies. Curiosity, a little voyeurism, and an instinctive desire to judge. Through it all I learned something else I hadn't planned for. Pleasure is not the reward of revenge. The reward is knowledge, the cold certainty that you can still wield cause and effect. And at night, when the city thinned out and the lights dimmed, I would sit with the files and the recordings and feel that satisfaction settle like frost across the pane. I was inching toward the end game, toward the moment when the directorate's secrets would be exposed and when Raines would have to account for the men he'd sent into people's lives to shatter them. But I also knew this: exposure doesn't equal justice. Systems protect themselves. Men who survive are clever, and they leave contingencies. There would be losses. There would be flames. The truth was only a blade until someone else forged the law around it. Still, as the pieces fell, I felt the fracture widen in their fortress. And in that widening, I prepared the strike I had been engineering since the night I first saw Anna with Ethan. One calculated, inevitable, and designed to leave the directorate with no comfortable places left to hide. Tomorrow I would test whether the net I'd woven would hold. Tomorrow I would push Raines to react. Tonight I slept with a copy of the ledger trace tucked beneath my pillow, and a quiet prayer to no one in particular. Let the plan be clean. Let the fallout be contained, and may the people I once loved survive the ruin I would create for them. There are moments in a plan when the world seems to hold its breath, the day when cause and effect line up like gun sights, and you know with a certainty that is almost cruel, this is the point of no return. I chose a Thursday because Raines had his weekly oversight luncheon with several board members from the firms he advised. He liked Thursdays. Thursdays let you end a week with a sense of control, of having steered the ship through the storm. He'd been smug since the whispers first reached him because men like him assume their machinery will cover every eventuality. That smugness was a weakness I intended to exploit. The media pieces had been seeded 2 days earlier, a series of small, precise leaks to old contacts who owed me favors. A local investigative reporter ran the first line, a story framed as a routine inquiry into unusual consulting expenses. The second was a longer piece from Mara, the journalist I'd rekindled contact with, who'd once loved a story enough to move countries for it. She took the lead and threw everything into the light. Harbor Analytics show contracts, timestamp transfers, forged signatures that bore my handwriting like a ghostly watermark. Within hours, the firm's phones lit up like Christmas trees. Raines' first reaction was to deny, then to designate. He called in his crisis team, lawyers in crisp suits who tried to spin out a narrative of patchwork accounting and clerical error. That's the first fallback of men who build empires on the backs of other people's lives. They insist they are tidy, that errors are accidents, that systems fail but people are innocent. Somewhere in those rooms there are men who still believe paper can save them. I did not. Phase 1 had been exposure. Phase 2 had been destabilization. Phase 3 was extraction. If you expose an organism to its own blood, it flails. When it flails, it leaves tracks. I needed those tracks. I waited until the luncheon broke and Rains was alone in his corner office, the panoramic windows showing a city that still believed order ruled it. I'd already arranged the physical layer. A courier with a thumb drive disguised as insurance paperwork would accidentally drop a folder on the receptionist's desk. The folder contained a video, an internal executive meeting where names were spoken plainly, harbor analytics, offshore routing, and, most damningly, the phrase I'd captured months before, termination authorized pending full transfer. I timed the delivery to coincide with a simultaneous cyber probe. My script's slow patient, the digital equivalent of a tapeworm, had crept into a decommissioned backup node that Rains's team used rarely, and once I opened that node, it relayed a live mirror of anything accessed on his main terminal. In effect, I made his office a live broadcast to several journalists and to a legal counsel I'd fed with a recorded chain of custody. He was in a fishbowl. The video hit his inbox as he was scrolling through emails. He watched face draining of color, the way any man does when a word in a language you thought belonged to you suddenly appears spelled with proof. He reached for the phone, fingers shaking, and that's when my phone rang. It was Rachel. "Are you doing it?" she asked. The line was steady. Her voice no longer trembled the way it had the peer. She sounded practiced at repression, which cuts both ways. It means you're less likely to betray panic, but it also means something else has been carved into you. "Yes," I said. She paused. "I'm here. I'll watch the feeds. If they move, I'll tell you." Her eyes had become the only place I could measure the temperature of this thing. She'd moved from the cold of being a pawn to a role that was almost collaborator when she let me use her connections. I didn't like it, but liking wasn't part of the equation anymore. Rains didn't go quietly. He called his security, and 2 men arrived at his office within 10 minutes. They were young and professional. They had the exact look of men who had never had to make moral calculations late at night. That kind of militancy can be purchased. Loyalty can be rented. The first shock came when the courier walked in. The receptionist, a small woman with tired eyes, opened the folder, saw the video, and without drama, handed it directly to a junior associate who then left the building. By the time the security team reached the room, journalists were on the phone, live streams were starting, and Rains had a copy of his own incrimination playing on a monitor that would soon be in court records. The second shock came faster. Rains' safety net was threaded together from legal counsel, private contractors, and political favors. It was a web-like structure of mutual assured impunity, but those webs get greasy when you pour oil on them. I'd lit matches in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. I'd put copies of the ledger on servers in law firms, newsrooms, and a couple of international NGOs that had teeth. The cascading effect was procedural and inevitable. Someone somewhere would find the pattern and not be willing to ignore it. When the police first showed up at Rains' building, they were acting on a call from the building manager reporting suspicious access. The police found a man in a suit in Rains' office with an email thread showing the termination authorization. The man was Rains' fixer, Jonas Hale, an executive who'd always been a step too smooth. He was taken in for questioning, his phone confiscated. Jonas had no idea his phone's backups were broadcasting to people who'd been waiting. It was the domino moment I'd hoped for, the one where the directorate's trained reflexes turned into noise and exposed the men who'd pulled the strings for years. Rains' response mutated from denial to damage control. He attempted to call in favors, to bury footage with money and threats. But money can't unring a bell, and threats are less effective when the cameras are on. I moved to the physical endgame. I had trailed Rains' schedule days before. Men like him get predictable. They are groomed by power to be punctual, to trust routines. He had a safe house outside the city where he liked to sleep when the heat rose. He preferred a glass of scotch at midnight and a plea-free call to an assistant who'd been with him for years. I parked my car half a mile away and watched the gate like a hawk. I didn't want spectators. I wanted the moment to be the same story. The man in a suit discovered by his own paperwork. When Rains arrived, flanked by one bodyguard, I was inside before he had closed the door behind him. There is an art to moving quietly. The house smelled of old leather and disinfectant. He didn't expect entrance through the air vents, and certainly not by someone he presumed broken and forgotten. He was on the phone when I stepped into his study, the ribbon of the flag outside his window visible through the blinds. He turned and saw me with the casual disbelief of a man who thinks his enemies are beneath his notice. "Ward," he said, the name a mix of annoyance and surprise. "I thought you'd be in custody." "No," I said, "just present." He stood slowly. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done," I replied. "You authorized lives to be terminated. That's not a sin you can fix with lawyers. You made it personal." He laughed softly. "You're sentimental. That's your weakness." "I have no sentiment left for you," I said. I stepped forward. "I came to give you a choice." "A choice?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Yes, one choice. Confess. Let the cameras see you own the decision. Tell the world why you ordered people erased and why Anna was used. Or two. I release every file I have to the press and I let the law chisel you like stone until there's nothing left." He smiled in that way men smile when they believe their money buys time. "You can't possibly have everything. I have layers, insurance, proxies, offshores. You think the world ends with me. So naive." "Maybe it does for you," I said. "Maybe it doesn't, but I can make sure the people who need to know do." Before he could answer, the front door crashed open and more footsteps filled the corridor, sirens distant, officers converging. He'd called his men. I'd sent a carefully worded anonymous tip to an officer who had no patience for institutional arrogance. He'd come because he was honest in the old way. He was a cop, and a story about a possible human rights violation with evidence would set any decent one in motion. He arrived with a warrant because the journalist who owned the leaked video had a lawyer who had notified the proper channels. Rains tried to bargain. He tried to buy time, to call in favors. His hands shook. He had built a universe in which his authority was absolute. For the first time, he looked like a man who'd been told he wasn't. Berest was messy human, not cinematic. Men shouted. A bottle clinked on the table. Rains cursed and called names. When they cuffed him, he looked at me for a long time, not with hatred but with puzzlement. He seemed to be trying to understand what kind of man could do what I'd done. "You could have come to me," he said, voice small. "We could have made this cleaner." "There is no clean," I said. "Not in what you built." In the weeks after Rain's fall, the directorate's scaffolding began to creak. There were hearings, subpoenas, and men who had been secure in their anonymity now discovering the social heaviness of being noticed. Ethan's firm reeled under the pressure. Melissa filed for separation. The news cycle consumed them and spat them out in pieces. Harbor Analytics was a name that would never reappear without a citation to scandal. But cleanup has its own machinery. Powerful men have friends with wrenches. Rain's fall did not exorcist the organization. It unsettled it. More troubling, it revealed how deep the rot ran. There were other directors, other shadow accounts, and an entire infrastructure built to make people disappear without a stain on paper. The head fell, but the body still had teeth, and in the middle of that shifting landscape, Anna disappeared. One morning she was simply gone. Her apartment lay open but empty, her toothbrush dry in the cup, the kettle cold. Her phone buzzed with unread messages that no one answered. It was almost theatrical, leaving a life like a prop on a stage. I could have guessed it. She'd told me Phase 3 was a trigger phrase. The moment the machinery believed it was being dismantled, it would lash out. They had options: exile, forced cooperation, or silence. I knew she feared silence more than anything. I'd buried myself in the wreckage, interviews, subpoenas, archived logs. I sat in courtrooms and watched lawyers circle like vultures. I watched Ethan's public implosion and felt a hollow place where my anger had been. The world rearranged itself, but not in the tidy lines I'd thought I'd draw. Consequences spread, and sometimes they landed on people who had already been broken. Rachel, Anna, had not stood at the pier when they arrived for me. She had been a step ahead, or a step taken by them. I didn't know which. That uncertainty lodged in my chest like a bone. So the endgame hadn't cleaned anything. It had made the rot visible and made more people frightened and dangerous. It had carved a new map of enemies. At night, I'd look at the files, at the videos, at the ledger copies, and remember how small the individual acts had been that led to all this: the wrong word, the wrong call, the faith that the world operated on principles instead of mercantile order. I had orchestrated an uprising small enough to feel intimate and large enough to topple men. But Athena, always watchful, taught me that wars seldom end with a single victory. They disperse. Men adapt. New leaders rise. I had the satisfaction of seeing one man's empire crumble, but I had also revealed a larger architecture of exploitation. I had lit a bonfire that burned more than I'd intended. When the dust settled and the cameras moved on to the next outrage, I found a message slid under my door. 3 words typed in all caps on a battered napkin. Phase 4. Active. It was the last thing I wanted to see. It meant someone higher up, someone who had not screamed or caved, had moved into action. Someone with the temperament to survive and the appetite to continue. They had options. I had scars. The strike had been successful in that it exposed Rains, damaged his network, and made the directorate scramble. But it had not ended the system that created the danger. It had only provoked it. Now it was personal again. Not just because Anna had vanished, but because this threat had a tail that could reach into the lives of people I couldn't afford to lose. They'd started a war, and wars demand consequences beyond revelation. I folded the napkin, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out into the city, where the lights were steady and the night smelled like rain. I had won a battle, but the campaign was not over. The next moves would be bloodier, smarter, far less forgiving. I thought of the first time Anna and I had kissed, the laugh we shared over a burnt pan, the way a life can be built from small, clumsy acts of love. That memory was as much a blade now as any file. It kept me human in a way that was both curse and mercy. If Phase 4 was active, then I had to be sharper. If they wanted to escalate, I'd answered escalation with exposure. Now, I'd have to answer with something colder still. Patience honed to a knife, and the kind of resolve that does not flinch when the cost is exacted on others. In the small hours, I sat with the ledger, the recordings, and the napkin. I made the next list. I gathered maps. I checked my old access points, my burner phones, my dead drops. I called one favor beyond the pale, and another beneath the surface. They'd set a war in motion. I'd lit the match. Now the fire would burn until one side could no longer stand the heat. Tomorrow I would start Phase 4, and I wasn't leaving any witnesses alive to regret it. They tell you, when you're young and idealistic enough to imagine a clean ending to a rotten story, that truth will set you free. They never tell you the rest. Freedom comes with a price, and truth is often only the match that lights a house on fire. Phase 4 arrived like a weather change, an invisible pressure that pushed at your throat until you couldn't breathe. The napkin under my door had been a warning. What came after was an ultimatum. Someone higher than Rain, someone colder, quicker, had moved into the frame. For them the directorate was not a menagerie of puppets. It was an instrument, a scalpel. If Rains had been careless, Phase 4 was surgical. I had a list of people I needed to see and a dwindling window to act. The city loosened itself into the late autumn that year. The air smelled like wet stone and forgotten things. I stopped pretending I could go back to the life I'd had. There was no going back. The ledger files were out in the world. The auditors were circling Ethan Cole's firm like vultures. Rains was cuffed, mouth open and ignorant in the booking photos. For a week, the papers cheered. For a week, the directorate's men lost sleep. That week also made its move. They tried to snatch Anna. I'd expected threats. Threats are cheap. You survive threats with counters and caution. But the way they tried to take her, because no, they didn't want her dead. They wanted her hushed but folded back into the machine, was clinical. They left no marks and no trace, and that was the worst kind, because it meant she had been taken without anyone knowing who'd committed the crime. I learned she'd been missing when her sister called me, voice raw like a violin string. She didn't come home, she said. Her keys are on the table. The kettle's cold. The sister's words were small and ordinary. The world they described was enormous and empty. I felt two things at once: the electric anger I'd lived on for months and a sharp animal fear. This couldn't be allowed to continue. If they could take her, they'd take anyone. My ledger and my leaks had been fireworks. The directorate had responded with a flame that could burn the city. So I moved fast, methodically, no drama, no heroics, just procedure. The same instincts that had let me slip into Ethan Cole's firm and seed the ledgers were now the tools that would find my wife. I started with the obvious: phone pings, surveillance sweeps, license plate readers. I pushed my access deep into the municipal feeds, old favors, payrolls I'd disguised, ghost credentials I'd never burned. The trail was faint, but it existed. A car crossing into industrial zones at 2:13 a.m., a van parked by a freight dock, a door opened at a shipping terminal and closed again 3 hours later. It led to a warehouse on the river, concrete hooks and cranes, the kind of place that eats sound. I drove there with a bag of things you had when everything collapses: a gun I'd never wanted to have to use, a badge that belonged to a client, never asked why I kept it, and a photo of Anna folded into the inside pocket of my jacket. The warehouse smelled like oil and old rain. It was a place where things went to be invisible. I counted exits, egress points, the placement of lights. They'd been careful, too careful, but nobody is infallible. I found Anna in a small office at the back. She was seated at a table, hands wrapped around a thermos. When she looked up and saw me, her face didn't register surprise first. It registered something that cut deeper: relief, then fear, then a kind of exhausted resignation. She was thinner. The light in her eyes wore a film, like the one you get after standing too close to a bonfire. "Ethan," she said, voice steady, one syllable like a warning. "You okay?" I asked. It was ridiculous to ask. The quiet answered me. She laughed, a thin sound. "They didn't want to kill me. They wanted me useful." She said it like someone reporting on weather. "They wanted leverage. But I made a choice." "You could have told me," I said. She looked away. The silence did not surprise me. She had lied too long, to me and to herself. There wasn't time for telling. There was only work. There was only phase 3, phase 4. If I didn't obey, they would have taken everything from you. Your company, your career, your life. You were already framed. I sat down opposite her. The table between us seemed huge. "Who?" She shook her head. "Not a who. A structure. The directorate's not a person. It's a process. They have chairs and names, but it's a machine built on hush money and guilt." She paused. "There is one person driving the phase now. He's not in the papers. He's in corridors you never enter. He doesn't eat or sleep much. He sees the world as a list of risks and mitigants. He called himself the steward when I met him." "Where is he?" I asked. She shrugged. "If I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here." She smiled, oddly tender. "You, on the other hand, have a gift for making people think they can hide." We were both quiet for a long time. I considered violence, diplomacy, entreaty. None of them felt sufficient. It's one thing to retaliate against a man like Rains. It's another to dismantle an apparatus that hides behind plausible deniability. You don't uproot an institution with a crowbar. You collapse the underlying ledger. That is what I chose to do. The idea was simple: force the steward to reveal himself by attacking the financial and political nodes that protected him. The leak that had taken Rains down would be part of a larger pattern: corporate whistleblowing, regulatory audits, and a public narrative that no one in power could safely ignore. But I also needed leverage directly against him. Names get you men. Men get comfortable. They make mistakes. I wanted one mistake. I baited him. First, I used the files. I had every contract, every timestamp, every forged signature to create a narrative of a clandestine program that funneled influence into policy. I pushed that package to public watchdogs in Europe, to a few international NGOs, and to journalists who do not sleep. I built an international heat map of money, and I made sure the money tracked back to places the steward could not easily touch without exposing his vantage points. Second, I sent a personal letter, bound in an envelope like an old-fashioned threat, but the tone was different. It was curiosity disguised as submission. If you want to keep the machine running, it said, we can talk about conditions. If you want to maintain your anonymity, think about how inconvenient international courts are to men who value their leisure. It was a taunt and a trap. Men like the steward can't resist seeing what the noise is when someone writes directly to them. Pride is a dangerous surveillance vector. Third, I used Anna. She was the key because they still trusted her at a level that made her useful as a vector. I told her to play a part again, pretend to cooperate, then leak. She would meet with their lieutenant under observation. I would be the shadow under the street lamp, ready to cut the thread at the right moment. It was dangerous, stupid, and necessary. She agreed because she had agency to reclaim. For the first time in months, she was not a pawn. She was an instrument. We rehearsed signals: 3 knocks on an overhead steel beam, the light flickered twice, a code simple enough to survive panic. The night came. Rain again, because the city thought it could wash sins away. Anna walked into the old library building, carved stone, too many pillars, great eaves that kept sound in. A man I'd never seen before met her, tall, neat, an expression that never quite showed a humanity. He was the lieutenant. He spoke in low cadences about Phase 4, about securing assets. Anna listened, said the right things. Then, when she signaled, I moved. It was not a Hollywood break-in. It was practiced, efficient. A man with a badge, a briefcase, and the confidence of someone used to doors opening for him would not be waiting for me to shove him into a wall. But we had leverage, evidence, a live feed to a journalist, and a recorder I'd disguised as a book inside the briefcase. When I pulled him aside and asked for a confession, he looked at me like a man seeing a dead relative standing at the foot of his bed. You know nothing, he breathed. Oh, I know more than that, I said. Tell me who the steward is. He laughed, sardonic now, because men like this always presume there are more men behind the curtain. You think naming one name will win you anything? He asked. This house has rooms you don't even know how to enter. He was right. One name wouldn't win. So I made him admit something else. The method, he told me, under the pressure of the recorder and the knowledge that a journalist's phone was pointed toward the library doors, that the director used institutional layers to outsource dirty work: third parties, show companies, private contractors who provided deniability. He named Harbor Analytics, mentioned offshore nodes, and then, in a slip, he mentioned a property, a townhouse in the North Shore that the steward used when he came into the city. It was a slip worth everything. I had the address before the sentence landed. I moved while the lieutenant was still spitting excuses. I called Mar, my journalist contact, and whispered one sentence: North Shore townhouse, tonight. She was already on it. The camera vans and news teams were like moths to the intact flame. We arrived there before dawn. The townhouse was a bland, over-ornamented thing kept by people who neither feared nor loved it. I waited in the hedges, the recorder in my pocket. I didn't want to hit the man physically. I wanted him exposed. I wanted the world to see a person responsible for ordering children's lives erased and families ruined. He came out at 5:12 a.m. older than I expected, moving with the elegant slowness of a man who assumes time will always be on his side. He had a go bag, an envelope with papers, and a face lined with casual cruelty. I stepped out of the shadows. The street lamps made us theatrical. A camera light flashed as Mara stepped from the van and started to record. She'd arranged for law enforcement liaisons to be nearby, people who care about procedure and the public good. This time I let the law be the hammer, and the public I the pivot. "You're the steward," I said. He smiled, as men smile when they're sure of their impunity. "You don't know who you're talking to." I could have shot him. I could have dragged him, beaten his face, left him pleading in a gutter. Instead, I offered him a choice similar to the one I'd once given Rains: confess, or watch as everything we feared came loose. The camera rolled. Mara's voice was steady. He tried to bargain. He threatened. He cursed. He offered to cut deals, promising millions to select funds if I would stop, if the journalist would bury the tape. He underestimated both the resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose and the appetite of a press corps hungry for a story that mattered. He chose words over silence, and then he chose the wrong person to trust. A single lawyer passed a copy of the notebook I'd kept, every ledger, every forged signature, all the routes of money, sent it overnight to an international tribunal that specializes in corruption and state capture. The steward's safe houses were yet another layer of deniability. They did not survive the world's attention. The arrest that followed was quieter than I had expected. He was taken in by men who did not want fanfare. They moved like professionals. People who build systems to coerce others have an uglier way of falling. They fall into paperwork, into records, into a legal vortex that grinds them down. Rains had been a public spectacle. The steward's arrest was an administrative collapse. Afterwards, in the hollow place where victory should have been, I found only the residue of cost. The directorate didn't vanish. Men with long careers in pliant institutions retreated and recalibrated. New chairs were filled. The mechanisms shifted. But a crucial thing had happened. The network that allowed people to disappear had been exposed publicly enough that governments and media could no longer ignore it wholesale. It was not eradicated. It was made dangerous to use at scale. And then Anna walked toward me. They had put her in witness protection safe houses, aliases, and a new life pending testimony. She could go anywhere the system could not find her. Instead, she chose an in-between. "You could leave," I said when we sat on the bench outside the courthouse. The rain had stopped. The city smelled like paper and steam. "You can take the drive," they offered, the new name. "You can vanish." She looked at me like someone reading the map of an old country. "I can't," she said. "They used me to make a weapon. I'd been complicit for long enough to know that walking away is a luxury I don't deserve. Besides," she touched my hand, thin and cool, "I didn't make this for them." She told the truth then, that the leaks we'd released were not just my doing. She had quietly copied files on the nights she went to the meetings, kept keys in places she hoped she'd never need. And when the moment came, she had given me the one thing that made the machinery fall apart: the context. My records on ledger entries were the spark. Her files were the accelerant that made the fire visible everywhere. We sat under the courthouse steps and let the city roll past. People moved with their lives intact, sometimes blissfully ignorant, sometimes aware and hardened. The press had a feeding frenzy the likes of which I'd never seen. Men I'd admired as brilliant were indicted. Ethan Cole's name became a cautionary tale. Rains's face was plastered on televisions worldwide. The steward's arrest cracked the outer shell of power. Judges spoke about precedents. There were committees and investigations, and nice prose in respectable publications. But the personal losses persisted. The marriage had been killed long before the trials. The life we had built together was a neat set of photographs and a pile of shared memories that now felt like two different archives. Trust is not something you can rebuild with apologies and public indictments. A month after the steward's arrest, The director of the agency overseeing the directorate issued a statement about reforms. Laws would be written. Panels convened. The world cheered in a modest way. Good men took bows. But Anna and I knew better. Institutions adapt. We both had choices. She could testify, appear as a witness, and perhaps be the bridge the prosecutors needed. She could enter a Scandinavian program and vanish. She could disappear into a small town in Portugal and become an anonymous woman who tended a garden. The options were almost insulting in their variety. She surprised me. She said she would testify, but under one condition. She wanted the truth broadcast as far as possible, not just to topple men, but to make the tools of the network visible and harder to use. If the public knows the roots, she said, it makes it harder for them to be secret. Mara arranged a global story broadcast, documents released to multiple outlets, encrypted seeds planted across the web. She did the work journalists do when they remember why they chose the job, making power accountable. When she took the stand, I felt something like nausea. Watching her speak precise and damaged was like watching a woman cut herself in slow motion to give her own organs to a dying man. She gave testimony that saved people she'd been forced to harm. She owed her culpability honestly. She refused to lie to make herself smaller. The prosecutors were merciless in the best way. They used facts. The defense tried things that fell flat. The headlines that week were brutal. After the trial, after the chorus of men reduced to statements and apologies, after the suits and the neat indictments, Anna sat with me in a small cafe near the water. She ordered tea. Her hands had tremors, ghosts of months of fear. The woman who drank tea across from me was not the same woman I'd married. She was someone better and worse, honest and implicated, brave and broken. What now? I asked her. She looked at the window, watching gulls. Now we try to live with what we did. Now we admit that being human isn't a portfolio to manage. It's being messy and terrible and kind. We can't undo what happened. We can only keep the ledger honest. I wanted to argue. I wanted to rail about trust and justice and the cruel arithmetic of loss. Instead, I reached for her hand and held it until she squeezed back. We weren't making a new life. We were making a life out of the wreckage. That would have to be enough. Months later, when the heat cooled, I realized what I had lost and what I had gained. Rains and the steward were gone, not fully purged, but moved out of easy reach. The directorate's methods had been exposed, and that exposure forced policy and scrutiny in places that previously looked the other way. The news cycle moved on, because it always does. New scandals replaced old ones. New men took old chairs. But the ledger remained in many hands worldwide, in public repositories, in press rooms and courts where it would be harder to bury. As for me, I did not go back to the office. I had lost a marriage and gained a clarity I hadn't wanted. I taught now part-time, under an assumed name, cybersecurity ethics at a community college. A small thing, useful. It kept me from becoming static in rage. Anna did what she could to rebuild trust with her family, made amends to the people she'd hurt. She became, slowly, a different kind of journalist, one who refused anonymous sources when a name could be placed in the light. There are nights when I wake with the residue of the ledger on my hands. There are nights when I dream of the black Audi and the motel light and the way trust can be engineered like a heist. But there are other nights now, quiet talks over tea, walks without checking who might be watching, the small mercy of a city that continues to turn even when its insides leak. The cost was steep. The revenge I'd planned and executed left smoke on the air and hearts scarred. I would not say I had no regrets. I would say only this: there are reckonings that are necessary. They choose you as much as you choose them. When you light a match under a corrupt machine, you should be prepared to stand in the room as it goes up. If the truth set me free, it was a freedom boiled down to a bone. You will live with what you do. You will remember the faces, the soft lies, the hard consequences. You will try to be better. That's all any of us can ask. I don't know if justice ever truly wins against systems that are designed to survive. What I know is this: I watched people who believed themselves invulnerable fall like paper. I watched the woman who had been my wife choose a hard, honest life over comfort. I watched the city change its rules in small, crooked ways. In the end, the ledger sits where it always has, somewhere between memory and law. People will try to write over it. People will try to forge it again. And somewhere, across the city, the hum of power will pulse on. But now there are lights that watch the ledger's pages. That is the small mercy. I pour my whiskey rarely now. I keep my files backed up in places no one would think to look. I sleep with the knowledge that I was a man who took a match to an entire machine. I accept the burn marks. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the rain starts to fall, I pick up an old photograph of Anna and me from before any of the machinery entered our lives. We are smiling, stupid and clean. I do not pretend to return to that. I only lay the picture face down and keep it safe. The city hums. I listen. I remember. I move forward in pieces, in stitches, in small, careful steps. The price of betrayal had been steep. The price of truth was steeper. But if the world could be nudged toward a little more light, then the ledger, burned or not, had at least one line that would not be erased. End of the story.